welcome to the deep dive, where we take all those sources you give us and try to like pull out the stuff that really makes you think.
And yeah, today is, well, a pretty interesting mix. We've got philosophy, some economics, a bit of history, even some poetry thrown in there to shake things up.
Yeah, exactly. And for this deep dive, I think what we're really trying to figure out is like all these connections, between individual freedom and the systems we live under and how that ties into the economy, like even personal growth.
I don't know about you, but it kind of feels like we're going on a little bit of an intellectual treasure hunt.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And one thing that keeps popping up for me as we go through these sources is this sort of tension. It's like a constant push and pull between what we want as individuals, being in control of our lives, and all those sometimes hidden ways that societies and systems kind of shape what we do and even like what we believe. Right, right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that really jumped out at me early on was that whole like unsettling idea of people becoming thinking, self-developing spare parts within a system. What's the deal with that?
Well, it's this idea that in a very structured system, people might start to be seen as valuable mainly because of their function within that system, instead of for their own potential or like their own unique growth. So if you're just a cog in the machine, then independent thinking and personal development can actually be seen as almost like a problem.
Yeah. And then you have this concept of a neo-slaveholding system where, and this is the crazy part, people think they're totally free. It's like those prison bars are all in their minds. So how do you even begin to break out of something like that?
Well, the sources seem to agree that step one is recognizing that you might actually be in that kind of system. It's about questioning the assumptions and narratives that you've always taken as like the absolute truth, and realizing that there might be these like subtle forces out there that are shaping your choices and belief, maybe without you even noticing it.
Which is kind of what that poem we were looking at is all about, right? It's that
Yeah.
feeling of waking up one day and realizing you've been chasing the wrong things. The burden of an inactive conscience, and everything just seems kind of empty. Lowliness of desires and meaninglessness of ideas. It's a pretty powerful moment.
Definitely. That poem really captures that moment of disconnect, between the life you've been living, all those societal expectations, and like this deeper sense of what actually matters. It's about breaking free from those norms, those pursuits that have kind of defined you up until that point.
Because the author here doesn't hold back. The main argument is basically that all these systems we've made, economic, social, whatever, are set up to exploit us until we're not useful anymore. That's a pretty harsh take, isn't it?
It is. The author sees this relentless pattern where the system's main goal is just to keep itself going, keep growing, even if it means people get used up in the process. And, for you, the listener, it really makes you think, how often do we actually stop and ask if these systems were part of our helping us, or are we just helping them?
And the way out, the solution they offer, isn't some big revolution, but something a lot more like internal. It's about learning to think for yourself, coming to a thoughtful understanding, not just taking in everything you hear at face value.
Exactly. It's that difference between truly understanding something and just kind of passively absorbing information.
Yeah.
The author's pushing for a more critical approach, digging into ideas, questioning assumptions, instead of just accepting everything you're told, especially from people who might benefit from your unquestioning belief.
It even takes a bit of a jab at some modern sciences like economics, suggesting that maybe they're more about misleading us than actually giving us, real knowledge. That's a bold statement.
It is. And it goes back to that idea that systems can obscure the truth. So maybe some economic models aren't really showing the full picture. Maybe they're leading societies down paths that actually hurt people in the long run.
Right. And then you have that great quote from Lincoln, books are needed to remind a person that his thoughts are not entirely original. Kind of a humbling thought, isn't it? Makes you realize you're part of a much bigger conversation that's been going on for a long time.
Absolutely. It emphasizes the vastness of human thought throughout history and why it's so important to actually engage with it. It encourages us to be, intellectually humble, realizing that learning often means building on the ideas of those who came before us, not just assuming we have all the answers.
So let's shift gears a bit. The text dives into this critique of modern economics by bringing up this older idea of chromatistic, which is how Aristotle defined it. So what's the big difference there?
What's really interesting here is how Aristotle makes this clear distinction between oikonomia, which is basically just managing a household, using resources wisely for the good of the family and the community, and crematistic, which is all about getting rich, especially for the sake of being rich. Aristotle believed that economics should be focused on, what people really need.
But crematistics, from his point of view, is different. It's all about profit for the sake of profit, even if it means taking advantage of others. So it's a totally different way of looking at what motivates the system, right?
Exactly. The focus shifts from sustainability, from meeting those real needs, to this constant chase for more money. And Aristotle thought that this was like unnatural and potentially damaging for both individuals and society because it creates the system where the goal is just to have more, even if it's not actually useful. So think about it. Where do you see the dominant focus today? Is it on sustainable well-being, or is it on this endless pursuit of profit? And, what does that say about how fulfilled we are as individuals?
Yeah. And he was really against usury, lending money with interest. He saw that as a prime example of crematistics because it makes money from money itself, not from actually creating anything.
Yeah. Aristotle saw usury as going against money's true purpose, which was to just make trade easier. By charging interest, money is basically creating more money, but without any real economic activity to back it up. He called it the most unnatural way to get rich. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, it raises questions about our modern financial system, where profits from things like financial derivatives can seem so far removed from creating anything of value in the real world. For you, the listener, this might bring up questions about debt and how you feel about the role of interest in the economy.
It does make you think, yeah. And then the text points out this interesting paradox. We have all this amazing technology, which should give us more free time, but it often feels like people are working harder than ever.
Yeah, that's a really important observation. The author's asking if our economic system is really designed to benefit the individual. If technology allows us to be more productive with less effort, why are so many people still struggling to make ends meet and working longer hours? It suggests that maybe the benefits of increased productivity are mainly going to the system itself, not to the people actually doing the work. And, that might resonate with you if you're feeling that work-life balance squeeze.
And this feeling that something's not quite right carries over into the whole discussion of global finance, starting with Charles de Gaulle and his pretty strong stance against the monetary system after World War II.
Yeah. What's fascinating about de Gaulle is how early on he recognized the potential for things to go off the rails.
Yeah.
He was critical of the Bretton Woods system, where the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold and other currencies were tied to the dollar. He wanted a system where currencies were backed by real assets, mostly gold, based on what countries actually had in their reserves.
And his demand in 1965 to trade France's dollars for gold, that really shook things up, especially with how the U.S. responded.
It did. The U.S. government, even back then, they seemed to realize how vulnerable they were, whether they could actually back up all those dollars with gold, even though they had a good chunk of the world's supply. So de Gaulle's move kind of exposed that. It showed that, these worries about the dollar's long-term stability, they're not new.
And for de Gaulle, it was about more than just money, right? He was also concerned about the bigger picture, about U.S. influence in Europe.
Exactly. He saw this U.S.-dominated financial system as being very closely linked to American geopolitical goals in Europe. He worried about the U.S. using its economic power to, force its way into European affairs, maybe even dragging European countries into conflicts they didn't want to be part of. And, him pulling French forces out of NATO command shows how serious he was about this.
So what ultimately caused the Bretton Woods system to collapse a few years later?
A whole bunch of things, really. Economic instability, rising inflation in the U.S., and a lot of speculative capital moving around. It put huge pressure on the system. And the U.S. just couldn't keep that fixed dollar-to-gold link as their gold reserves kept shrinking. And so in 1971, President Nixon, he just ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. That pretty much ended the Bretton Woods era.
And that's when things like special drawing rights, or SDRs, start popping up. It's like a virtual currency, right?
Yeah.
So what are they exactly, and why were they created?
So SDRs were created by the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, as this extra kind of international reserve asset. They're not a regular currency that you can use in the store, but they're like a claim on the usable currencies of all the IMF member countries. They were supposed to help countries, if they had imbalances in their payments with other countries. They also were supposed to give the global financial system more liquidity. And the value of an SDR is based on a basket of several major currencies, a weighted average.
It's starting to sound a little theoretical, isn't it? And then the text brings up hedonistic indices and virtual investments supposedly inflating GDP, particularly in the U.S. What does that even mean in the real world?
Well, it's this idea that how we calculate GDP these days might include things that don't actually represent, like real stuff being made or real value being created. So, for example, these hedonistic indices try to put a number on how much better the quality of goods and services are over time, so they add some estimated value to GDP based on that. And the author also says that all these complicated financial activities, what they call virtual investments, they also contribute to GDP figures, but without necessarily reflecting any actual output in the economy. One example given is imputed rent, which is basically an estimate of how much homeowners would pay to rent their own homes from themselves. It makes you think about how we even measure economic progress. Are we looking at real growth or something more like a virtual representation?
Yeah, if you took away all the virtual stuff, the U.S. economy might look totally different, at least according to this analysis.
Right. The author points to data suggesting that there's a pretty big gap between the official GDP numbers and those adjusted figures that don't count all those virtual indices. Makes you wonder, if a lot of an economy's growth is based on these kinds of estimations, how healthy is it, really? It's something to think about whenever we hear about economic progress.
And then you have the whole normalization of deficit spending, which is kind of traced back to Roosevelt's policies. And that seems to have made people less worried about national debt, too.
That's the argument, yes. That Roosevelt's administration changed how people thought about government debt, suggesting that if the government's borrowing from itself, it doesn't really matter. But the author says that this kind of thinking weakened the public's ability to really keep an eye on government finances. And it gave the executive branch a lot of power to spend without any real checks and balances. And if we think about the long game, this might have contributed to this trend where we don't really worry so much about government spending anymore.
Then we get into the IMF, which the text describes as basically a credit club where the rich countries lend to the poorer ones. And then there's that cynical quote from Alfred Moser about money flowing from poor people in rich countries to rich people in poor countries. What's the point being made there?
Well, that quote is a pretty critical take on how international aid sometimes works. The author suggests that the IMF, while it might seem like it's helping, often operates in a way that mostly benefits those lending countries and the wealthy elites within the borrowing countries. So it might actually make the gap between rich and poor even bigger instead of closing it. And the way voting power is set up in the IMF based on how much money countries contribute, that kind of reinforces this idea.
But despite all this apparent instability, the U.S. dollar is still pretty strong, even though it's not backed by gold. What's keeping it afloat?
Well, the author says it's mainly about psychology, people still trusting and accepting the dollar. And also because the dollar has had this status as a kind of commodity since 1973, after the Jamaica Accords. So even though it's not tied to gold anymore, it's still widely accepted, used in international trade, and that acceptance kind of creates its own demand, especially in that virtual economy we were talking about.
But relying on the unbacked dollar like this does have its downsides, right?
Yeah.
Especially for things like U.S. manufacturing and that whole flow of capital needed to cover the balance of payments deficit. How does that work?
Right. So when the dollar's value fluctuates, it can make stuff made in the U.S. more expensive for other countries, which hurts American manufacturing. But on the other hand, it can make imports cheaper. And the text also points out that the U.S. needs a lot of investment from other countries to cover its balance of payments deficit, which basically means they're relying on money coming in from elsewhere to cover all their spending.
And the author seems pretty convinced that the dollar is eventually going to collapse. It's just a matter of time before big players in the financial world start looking for something more stable.
That's the prediction, yeah.
Yeah.
The argument is that the whole system is just too unstable, and because those major currencies aren't really backed by anything tangible, eventually people are going to want something else. Maybe it'll be another currency, or maybe it'll be something new entirely, like those SDRs or some other kind of digital thing. And for you, the listener, this might make you think about where you're putting your trust financially, How do you prepare for the long term if the global landscape is going to change so drastically?
And the stuff they say about what might happen after a dollar collapse, it's pretty intense. Widespread poverty, people defaulting on their debts, and everyone's savings just disappearing.
It's a grim scenario for sure. The author says that without all that artificial support, a big devaluation of the dollar could wipe out people's savings. It would lead to massive defaults on debts that are held in dollars, and it would hit those economies that hold large dollar reserves particularly hard. Without that real commodity backing, all those dollars would be practically worthless.
And the big takeaway for countries is that by letting the dollar flow freely within their borders, they're basically tying themselves to this American virtual economy. And they're stuck with it until the rest of the world decides to move on.
Exactly. The message is that as long as your economy is deeply linked to the dollar, you're going to be vulnerable to all those problems in the U.S. financial system. The author suggests that true economic independence means finding alternatives to the dollar, maybe focusing more on those tangible assets we were talking about.
And then this whole discussion about the value of money leads into this really interesting question about the value we put on, like priceless cultural artifacts. That example with Van Gogh, dying penniless while his paintings are selling for millions now, really shows that disconnect.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one. It's about that huge gap between the real value of art, its cultural significance, the emotions it evokes, its historical importance, and how much it actually sells for on the market. The author questions why we put these huge price tags on something we call priceless, especially when the artists themselves often struggled financially. It makes you wonder, who really benefits from turning art into a commodity like that and how they even decide what those crazy prices should be.
And the text makes this clear distinction between, real art and show business. Using that poem about how true talent is so rare and how fame is often manufactured, it makes you think about what we really value in art.
Absolutely. The poem gets at that difference between authentic creativity, real expression, and that whole world of celebrity and mass entertainment that's so carefully constructed. True artistic talent is rare, the poem says, but fame that can be manufactured often through marketing and PR, sometimes with not much substance behind it.
And when art becomes a commodity, that also brings a lot of risk, right? Like theft, damage. When something is worth so much money, it becomes a target.
Of course, if people see art primarily as a way to make money, then it naturally becomes like a magnet for criminals. The focus shifts from preserving and appreciating the art to just owning and trading it. And unfortunately, that means the chances of something being stolen or damaged go way up.
Then there's this point about how a country's currency might not actually reflect the value of its people's work, and suggests that if labor becomes cheap, it might mean the individual is being devalued, along with the purpose of the state itself. That's quite a connection to make.
It is. The author's challenging that whole idea of a fair exchange, The work we do, the money we get for it. If the value of labor goes down, doesn't that mean that individuals, just as parts of the economic system, are also being devalued? It makes you think about what a state is really for. Is it just about economic activity? Or does it have a deeper responsibility to its citizens?
And that ties into Plato's idea that wealth only has real value if the person who owns it is virtuous.
Yeah.
It's like a reminder that just having money doesn't make you a good person or guarantee you a good life.
Exactly. Plato reminds us that character matters, that moral integrity is what really gives wealth its worth. Without virtue, wealth can be used for all the wrong reasons. It can lead to corruption, unhappiness. So the point is that pursuit of money needs to be guided by ethical principles.
And the text even talks about how that constant chase for money, it can actually prevent you from actually realizing your ideas and make you feel like a slave.
Yeah.
Or just unhappy.
That's a recurring theme, The danger of making money your only goal in life. The author says that this can kill creativity, leave you feeling empty, and basically trap you in a system that values profit over everything else.
And you have that pretty extreme quote from Quintilian. Destroy money and you destroy wars. Pretty radical, but what's the reasoning there?
Quintilian's point is that a lot of conflict comes down to greed, to this desire for wealth. So take away money, you take away that fuel for competition, for fighting. Now, it might sound idealistic, but it does highlight how destructive that drive for economic gain can be.
The author then argues for a system where the value of things is based on how beneficial they are to society and the environment, which is so different from how it works now, where a lot of times the worst things for us are the cheapest.
Yeah, that would be a big shift, wouldn't it? Instead of just looking at the price tag, the author suggests taking into account the real costs and benefits for society and the environment. So you'd be encouraging people to produce and consume stuff that's sustainable, that's actually good for us. And those harmful products, well, they would be discouraged, even if they're making a lot of money right now.
And that whole critique of free market competition as just a ruthless struggle, where it's not even guaranteed to lead to the best use of resources, that raises some good points too, especially when you look at historical economic downturns.
Yeah, the author doesn't think the free market is this perfect system. They say that unrestricted competition can lead to chaos, way too much production of stuff that's not needed, and that ultimately leads to economic instability, like those booms and busts we've seen throughout history. So maybe some level of regulation, some societal oversight is actually necessary for a more stable and fair system.
And that example with a single night of heavy drinking and all the negative consequences that ripple out from that, it really shows how much these things we see as normal can have hidden costs.
Right. The author uses this very vivid image to show those broader costs associated with certain behaviors, even the ones that everyone accepts. Like accidents, violence, burdens on the healthcare system. Those costs aren't usually factored into the price of those things.
And the point being made that modern crematistics kind of hides this conflict between individual good and societal good. It's a recurring theme, isn't it?
It is. The argument is that our economic system often puts private interests above the well-being of everyone. And that leads to situations where individuals or corporations profit at the expense of, the environment, public health, things like that.
And having too much wealth, well, that can buy you more than just stuff, right? It
Yep.
can buy you power, which leads to what they call hypertrophied self-importance. It's a warning about how wealth can corrupt not just individuals, but the whole system.
Yeah, the author's concerned about how concentrated wealth can lead to like an imbalance of power. So you get policies that benefit the wealthy, which just creates more inequality. And that excessive focus on getting rich, driven by ego, can distort a society's priorities.
That bit from Richard Aldington's Supping with the Devil
Yep.
about people judging each other based on like superficial stuff, it feels kind of random at first. How does that fit in here?
Well, it reminds us how easily we can fall into prejudice, judging people based on things that don't really matter instead of their character or what they contribute. And in these systems, economic and political systems, that kind of irrational bias can lead to like unfair outcomes and keep those inequalities going.
Now, the explanation of fractional reserve banking as creating this meaningless flow of insane money, that's some strong language. Can you break that down for us?
The author is super critical of that whole system, the fractional reserve banking system, where banks are only required to keep a small percentage of their deposits on hand. They can lend out the rest, which essentially creates new money. And the argument is that this lets the money supply grow without any real economic growth to back it up, which leads to inflation and instability, hence the unbacked and insane money description.
And the luxury life industry is seen as a key place for all that money to circulate, where the wealthy try to like set themselves apart by buying expensive things that are often overpriced. It's all about showing off, isn't it?
Exactly. The author's suggesting that when the wealthy have more money than they could ever really need, they turn to those luxury goods and services as a way to like show off their status. The
Yeah.
prices aren't really about how much something's actually worth, but about what it symbolizes.
Then you have these financial instruments like futures, where people can basically bet on things that don't even exist yet, and it benefits these financial players without creating any real value for anyone else. It's all just speculation, isn't it?
That's the critique, yeah. These complicated financial instruments, the author sees them as disconnected from the real economy, where actual stuff is being produced and services are provided. They can be used to manage risk, but they also allow for a lot of speculation, people making money without actually contributing to anything.
And those online trading platforms, where a lot of people are just playing without their money ever really going into the actual Forex market, that just adds another layer to this whole virtual system.
Right. A lot of those platforms, they operate like closed systems. The money traded there doesn't necessarily go into the real interbank foreign exchange market, the one where the big currency transactions happen. So it's more like gambling within the platform itself, and often the platform benefits when people lose money.
You know that quote from Nikolai Nosov's Dunno on the Moon about the rich only caring about money and not seeing anything else? It seems to really capture that mentality, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's a sharp critique of that materialistic worldview where money is the only thing that matters. It's like people get so focused on getting rich that they become blind to, the needs of others, the potential for real human development beyond just money.
And that contrast between Las Vegas with all its artificial wealth and the emptiness of Death Valley, that's a powerful image. It really makes you think about what's real and what's just a facade.
For sure. Las Vegas is this constructed reality all about entertainment and spending money. Death Valley is raw nature, It's a reminder that some forms of wealth are artificial, detached from real value.
We also get a glimpse into the history of banks and the whole practice of usury, which, as we talked about, has always had a pretty bad reputation.
Right. It's a reminder that banks have this long history of facilitating trade, but also a long history of usury, of making profit from lending money. And this ties back into that critique of chrematistics, those ongoing ethical questions about debt and interest that we still deal with today.
And then explaining how all those banking operations, the withdrawals and deposits, how they affect the money supply and that whole banking multiplier thing, it helps you understand how easily things can become unstable in the financial system.
Yeah, that multiplier effect is key. Because of that fractional reserve system and all the lending and borrowing, a small deposit can actually lead to a much bigger increase in the money supply. But that also means that financial shocks can be amplified, which contributes to that instability we were talking about.
The text makes this pretty strong statement that those who only care about money, they lack morals and thrive in what's called a demonocratic system. What's the idea behind that?
Well, it's this idea that focusing only on getting rich can make you less ethical. In a system where money is the most important thing, people without strong morals, they might be more likely to take advantage of others. And democratic is used here to describe a kind of distorted democracy where those people actually flourish.
And this system, it's not just hurting agriculture, right? It's also damaging industry, even pointing to the National Bank of Ukraine as contributing to this influx of unbacked dollars.
The author sees this pattern, where economic policies end up harming both traditional industries and modern manufacturing. And that criticism of the National Bank of Ukraine suggests they think that institutions that are supposed to be protecting the economy are actually making it worse.
And they draw this important distinction between investors who actually share in real production and usurers who just make money without creating anything, which also fuels inflation.
Yeah, they see those as two fundamentally different ways of thinking about finance. Investors, they put money into the real economy, they help create stuff, and they share in the risks and the rewards. Users, on the other hand, just profit from lending money, whether or not it leads to anything productive. And that can lead to, more inflation.
And that point about predatory lending leading to businesses going bankrupt and being destroyed, it's a reminder that these financial games have real-world consequences.
Exactly. In places where there's corruption or instability, those predatory lending practices can be used to deliberately bankrupt businesses that would otherwise be doing fine. And then those creditors swoop in and take their assets for a fraction of what they're worth. It can destroy jobs, and it can hurt a country's ability to produce things.
It's interesting that there's been historical resistance to the power of banks, even in the U.S. It shows that these concerns aren't new.
Yeah, throughout history, there have always been people who've challenged the power of banks. They've worried about, the potential for them to abuse their power. And it's a good reminder that our current financial system isn't some kind of inevitable thing. It's been a subject of debate and pushback for a long time.
And the mention of the Rothschilds and other banks historically being the ones to set the price of gold, that just shows how much influence these private entities have had on the global financial system.
Right. It highlights that concentrated power, Those banks, they were able to influence not just the price of gold, but also the whole mood of the market.
So all this talk about how Forex trading through these dealing centers is often separate from the real interbank market and how most people end up losing money, well, it makes those online trading platforms sound a lot less glamorous.
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand that about retail Forex trading. Those dealing centers, they're basically running their own markets and they're taking the other side of their clients' trades. So most people trading within those systems, they lose money. It's more like betting against the house than actual investing.
That quote from Article 13 of the Ukrainian Constitution about the people owning natural resources, it leads to a really basic question. Why should private companies be allowed to profit from extracting and selling those resources back to the people?
It gets to the heart of economic justice, Who benefits from those resources that belong to everyone? The author's saying that the profits should go back to the people, not just to those companies.
And the statement that war is not funny, especially given what happened in Iraq and the whole weapons of mass destruction thing, that's a sobering reminder that these geopolitical games have real human costs.
Definitely. The author's emphasizing the tragedy of war, questioning all those justifications that are used to start conflicts. The Iraq War, that's a perfect example of how misinformation and political decisions can have devastating consequences for people's lives.
And then the text argues that a lot of those interventionist policies by the U.S. and NATO, things like the Libya invasion in 2011, were really about controlling oil and getting rid of leaders who didn't want to play ball. It's a pretty cynical take on international relations.
It is. It suggests that those interventions aren't always about humanitarian reasons, but maybe more about economic self-interest, like securing access to oil and maintaining political control. It's presented as part of this pattern of powerful countries dominating weaker ones.
And the point being made that all those explanations for why oil prices go up and down, maybe they're just hiding manipulation of the global economy and global politics, that suggests there's a much deeper game going on.
Right. The author thinks that those official reasons for oil price changes are often a cover-up, concealing the use of oil as a tool for global control. It's a way to manipulate markets for geopolitical gain.
So bringing it all back, that core idea of crematistics, the art of making money from money, it really comes full circle here.
Yeah, the author wraps up this section by emphasizing that our current economic system is all about making money for its own sake. It's not about managing resources well or, making sure society benefits.
Moving on to the nature of governance and society, we have this opening quote from Aristotle about how even the best forms of government can go bad. Kind of sets a cautious tone, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It introduces this idea that, no system is perfect, no matter how good its intentions are. Any system can become corrupted if the people in charge start abusing it.
And then the author says that democracy, the way we see it today, with its mix of oligarchy and what they call pseudo-aristocracy, well, thinkers like Plato and Aristotle might see that as basically rule by vassal leaders. What does that even mean?
So it's this idea that while it looks like the people are in charge in modern democracies, the reality is that wealthy elites, that's the oligarchy part, and people who gain power through, like status or connections, not real merit, that's the pseudo-aristocracy. They're the ones actually calling this error.